Daniel Moretti had built his life around predictability. Not comfort, control. The kind that came from keeping his distance, from leaving nothing behind that could follow him into the present. The city moved around him every day, loud and indifferent, and he moved through it unnoticed by design. He didn't expect the pause. Traffic slowed. People stepped off the curb. Daniel's attention drifted without interest until it stopped. She was there. Sophia Lane hadn't changed in any way that mattered. The same measured steps. The same guarded posture. The same way she held herself, as if the world required constant negotiation. Recognition hit Daniel before reason could intervene. Then he saw the child. The boy walked beside her quietly, his hand swallowed by hers. Too old to be carried. Too young to be unaware. There was nothing dramatic about him. No obvious resemblance. No undeniable proof. Just a wrongness in the timing that settled cold in Daniel's chest. Halfway across the street, Sophia shifted. Not toward Daniel. Away from him. She moved her body just enough to block the child from view, her grip tightening without thought. It was instinctive. Automatic. Practiced. Daniel didn't move. The light changed. People continued on. Sophia never looked back. But Daniel stayed exactly where he was, aware of something he had not felt in years, uncertainty. The past he had buried had not stayed buried. It had learned how to walk beside her. Daniel stayed where he was long after the light changed. The crowd thinned, shoes scuffing past him, voices dissolving into the noise of traffic. Cars began to move again, engines surging forward as if nothing unusual had happened. The city corrected itself with practiced ease. Only Daniel remained out of step with it. He replayed the moment without meaning to. The angle of Sophia's shoulders as she crossed. The way her grip tightened around the child's hand. Not panic, never panic. It was protection, immediate and unthinking, the kind that came from repetition. From years of doing the same thing every day. The boy had stumbled slightly. Sophia had reacted instantly, shifting her body between him and the street. The motion had been small, almost invisible. It was the kind of thing Daniel would have ignored once. Now it sat in his chest like weight. He told himself it meant nothing. People had children. Time moved on. Lives continued without permission. He had known that when he walked away. He had accepted it as the price of leaving cleanly. And yet the calculation refused to settle. The boy's age aligned too neatly with a year Daniel had tried not to count. The seriousness in his eyes lingered, unsettling not because it mirrored Daniel, but because it didn't look borrowed. It looked earned. Daniel exhaled slowly and forced his body to move. Standing still in the middle of the sidewalk invited attention, and attention was a habit he had broken long ago. He stepped aside, letting the current of pedestrians reclaim the space he'd occupied. Across the street, Sophia and the child had already disappeared. She hadn't looked back. That, more than anything else, told him she had seen him. The certainty settled quietly. Daniel walked the remaining distance to his car and closed the door behind him with deliberate care. He didn't start the engine right away. The interior felt smaller than it had moments ago, the silence too loud. He rested his hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield, seeing nothing. He had spent years believing that distance could freeze time. That if he didn't look, didn't ask, didn't return, the past would remain where he left it. Contained. Finished. The crossing had dismantled that illusion without effort. Somewhere in the city, Sophia was continuing her day. She would take the child where he needed to go. She would speak softly to him. She would make decisions that accounted for danger without naming it. She would do what she had always done, move forward. Daniel turned the key in the ignition. As he pulled back into traffic, the question followed him, unspoken and unwelcome. He didn't allow it to form fully. Questions demanded answers, and answers demanded action. He had built his life on knowing when not to act. But certainty, once fractured, did not return to its original shape. By the time Daniel reached the next intersection, he understood one thing with uncomfortable clarity. Whatever he had believed about leaving, about protection, about finality, had been wrong. The crossing had not reopened the past. It had revealed that it had never closed. Daniel had learned early that some choices didn't announce themselves as mistakes until years later. When he met Sophia, his life was already narrowing. Not collapsing, sharpening. He was learning how to remove excess, how to make decisions that left no loose ends. People mistook his restraint for coldness, but it was discipline. Discipline kept things from spilling into places they didn't belong. Sophia had belonged anyway. She had slipped past his defenses without trying, asking questions he didn't know how to deflect, noticing absences he had trained others not to see. With her, silence wasn't enough. She waited it out. She listened between words. She made space where he preferred edges. For a while, he let himself pretend it was temporary, that he could hold this part of his life apart from the rest. That affection could be compartmentalized like everything else. It was easier to believe that than to admit how quickly she had become a liability. Not to him, but because of him. The first warning came quietly. A conversation that stopped too abruptly. A name mentioned where it didn't belong. A look held a second too long. Daniel recognized patterns the way other people recognized faces. He didn't need proof to know when something was shifting. Sophia noticed the change before he spoke of it. She always did. She asked him one evening why he was pulling away. Not accusing. Not pleading. Just asking, as if the answer might be simple enough to say aloud. Her hands were steady when she spoke. That made it harder. Daniel told her what he had rehearsed. That his world was narrowing. That there were things she didn't need to be near. That staying would eventually cost her something he couldn't replace. He chose his words carefully, removing anything that sounded like doubt. He made it sound inevitable. Necessary. What he didn't say was that he was afraid. Afraid that loving her had made him predictable. Afraid that someone would notice the way his attention shifted when she entered a room. Afraid that one day a threat wouldn't come to him directly, but through her. He framed the decision as protection. He convinced himself that absence was cleaner than damage. That walking away now would spare her something worse later. It was easier to leave while she was still standing than to wait until she was broken. Sophia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she didn't argue. She didn't bargain. She looked at him as if she were memorizing something she didn't want to remember. Daniel left that night without looking back. He told himself that was strength. In the years that followed, he rebuilt his life around the space she left behind. He hardened the rules. He removed distractions. He proved, again and again, that he could function without what he had given up. What he never allowed himself to consider was the cost of that choice beyond himself. Until the crossing. Until the realization that walking away had not erased him from Sophia's life. It had only ensured that whatever came after, she faced it alone. Sophia's life ran on momentum. She woke before the city decided what it wanted from her, moving quietly through a small apartment that held only what was necessary. There was no room for clutter, not in space and not in thought. Every object had a purpose. Every minute did too. Noah emerged from his room each morning already alert, as if sleep were something he tolerated rather than needed. Sophia knelt to zip his jacket, smoothing the fabric with practiced hands. She checked his shoes, his bag, the way his shoulders sat beneath the weight of it. These rituals were not affection disguised as habit. They were vigilance made gentle. They walked everywhere. She liked the predictability of sidewalks, the way routes could be memorized and risks anticipated. Noah's hand fit easily into hers, small but certain. He watched the world carefully, noticing patterns, asking questions at odd moments. Sophia answered what she could and redirected what she couldn't. Children didn't need the whole truth to feel safe. They needed consistency. Work came in pieces. Hours stitched together from different places, different expectations. Sophia learned which corners to cut and which could not be compromised. Bills were paid in order of consequence. Sleep came in fragments. Hunger was negotiated. She never complained. Complaints wasted energy, and energy was something she could not afford to lose. There were nights when exhaustion pressed too close, when her hands trembled as she folded laundry or counted change at the kitchen table. In those moments, memory tried to intrude. A voice she had once trusted. A future she had briefly allowed herself to imagine. She pushed those thoughts aside without ceremony. The past had already taken enough. Noah was the reason she endured without resentment. He noticed things. The way she paused before crossing streets. The way she scanned rooms before sitting down. He learned early how to match his pace to hers, how to stay close without being asked. That knowledge hurt more than the scarcity ever had, but Sophia never let it show. At night, when the apartment finally went still, she sat at the edge of his bed and watched him sleep. The seriousness faded then, leaving softness in its place. She traced his features with her eyes, committing them to memory as if repetition alone could protect him from the world. She wondered sometimes if he would ask about his father. The question hovered, unspoken but present. Sophia had prepared answers she hoped she would never need. Silence, she believed, was kinder than half-truths. She had chosen it carefully. Raising Noah alone had stripped her life down to essentials and revealed what remained. Strength, she learned, was not loud. It did not announce itself or ask to be recognized. It showed up every day, quietly, relentlessly, because someone depended on it. Sophia did not need rescue. She did not need forgiveness. She needed time, and she built her life to earn it. One careful step, one held hand, one unbreakable routine at a time. Daniel did not chase certainty. He let it come to him. The night after the crossing, he returned to his apartment and moved through it without turning on unnecessary lights. The space was orderly, impersonal, arranged for efficiency rather than comfort. He had designed it that way. Nothing here asked anything of him. Sleep did not come. Instead, he sat at the table with a glass of water he didn't drink and let memory arrange itself. Dates he had avoided counting. Conversations he had archived and sealed. The year he left. The year Sophia would have been alone with decisions that could not wait for permission. By morning, he stopped pretending this was coincidence. Daniel reached out to people he trusted not to ask questions. He asked for schedules, not explanations. Records, not opinions. The requests were precise, framed as routine. He had always been good at making curiosity sound like logistics. The information arrived quietly, in pieces that refused to announce what they were becoming. An address. Modest. Stable. A work history built from fragments, overlapping hours that suggested endurance rather than ambition. No sudden windfalls. No unexplained gaps. Just consistency stretched thin. Then the child. Noah Lane. 6 years old. Daniel read the name once, then again. He did not react. Reaction was a luxury. He noted the birth date, the hospital. Public. Unremarkable. The absence where a second name should have been. There was a photograph. Taken from a distance, nothing intrusive. Sophia stood outside a school building, one hand resting lightly on Noah's shoulder. The boy was mid-sentence, his mouth caught between words, his posture alert without tension. He looked like someone who paid attention. Daniel felt the recognition settle deeper this time. It wasn't the face. It was the stillness. The way Noah held himself as if the world required readiness. Daniel had been described that way once long ago, before he learned to disguise it. He flipped through the remaining pages slowly. Routine medical visits. No emergencies. No other contact listed. Always Sophia. Only Sophia. There was nothing dramatic in the file. No single page that declared the truth outright. That was what made it impossible to dismiss. The evidence didn't shout. It accumulated. Daniel leaned back and closed his eyes. He pictured Sophia years ago, standing in that kitchen, listening to him explain why he was leaving. He pictured her after, carrying weight he had chosen not to share. He pictured her now, crossing streets with practiced caution, her body already positioned to protect. The truth assembled itself without permission. Daniel opened his eyes and stared at the photograph again. He did not touch it. He wasn't entitled to that intimacy. Not yet. Possibly not ever. What he knew was enough. The past had not been erased. It had been lived. And it had left behind something that could not be unlearned. Daniel noticed the shift before anyone named it. Patterns changed subtly at first. A car parked too long near Sophia's building, gone before it became familiar. A stranger lingering at the corner cafe where she sometimes stopped, attention angled carefully away. Nothing overt. Nothing careless. The kind of presence that suggested interest without purpose. It unsettled him more than an obvious threat would have. He had not spoken to Sophia. Had not approached her. Had not altered her routine directly. But attention had weight, and weight bent the world around it. He had lived long enough knowing how even restraint could cast a shadow. Daniel adjusted quietly. Routes were checked twice. Timings noted and discarded. He widened the circle without tightening it, careful not to turn caution into spectacle. Protection, if it was to exist at all, had to remain invisible. Still, the city noticed. People who watched for a living had learned to read absence as easily as presence. They saw when someone who never lingered began to linger. When questions were asked without names attached. When curiosity moved with too much discipline to be accidental. Daniel read reports without comment, his face revealing nothing. The words were neutral. The implications were not. Someone was mapping his attention backward, tracing it to its source. Sophia felt none of it. Her days continued as they always had, shaped by necessity and routine. She walked Noah to school. She worked. She returned home tired but intact. If she sensed something tightening around the edges of her awareness, she dismissed it. Survival had taught her not every shadow mattered. Daniel knew better. He stood at his window late at night. The city spread beneath him in orderly chaos. Somewhere within it, Sophia was locking her door, setting out clothes for the morning, preparing for another day that demanded more than it offered back. Somewhere within it, Noah was sleeping, unaware that his existence had shifted balances Daniel had spent years perfecting. That was the danger. Not the child himself, but what he represented. Proof that Daniel Moretti was not untouched by consequence. Proof that there was something in the world he could not afford to lose. The more carefully Daniel protected that truth, the more valuable it became to anyone watching for leverage. Messages began to arrive that said nothing directly. Old names resurfaced in casual conversation. Invitations extended without urgency. Warnings dressed as pleasantries. Daniel declined them all. He did not escalate. Escalation invited attention. Instead, he narrowed his margins. He slept less. He read more. He listened harder. Every decision passed through a new filter now, one he had never allowed before. How would this echo? Who would notice? What might it reveal? For the first time in years, Daniel understood the cruelty of his own reputation. The man who had built a life with no visible attachments had finally revealed one, without meaning to. And once revealed, it could not be unseen. The city did not yet know what it was circling. But Daniel did. Attention had a cost. And it was already being calculated. Daniel did not ask for permission. He never had. Protection began quietly, the way all careful things did. No names attached. No visible shifts that could be traced back to him. He arranged it as he arranged everything else, indirectly, with enough distance to deny intent. Eyes appeared where there had been none before. A man at the corner cafe who learned the rhythm of Sophia's mornings without ever meeting her gaze. A car that took the same turns as she did, never close enough to feel threatening, never far enough to lose sight. Routes were memorized, not altered. Interference was forbidden. Daniel studied reports the way others studied maps. Times. Intersections. Patterns that repeated, and those that broke without warning. He learned which streets Sophia avoided, and which she crossed without hesitation. He noted how Noah walked, alert but unafraid, and how Sophia adjusted her pace to match him without thinking. Nothing was to touch them. That was the rule. If danger surfaced, it was to disappear before Sophia or Noah ever sensed it existed. Daniel made that clear. There would be no displays of loyalty, no visible gestures of ownership. Protection was not a statement. It was a discipline. From a distance, he watched their lives unfold in fragments. Sophia at work, shoulders slightly hunched from fatigue rather than fear. Noah waiting outside school, backpack hanging too low, eyes scanning the street with quiet curiosity. Moments small enough to seem insignificant, heavy enough to alter him. Daniel told himself this was temporary. A measure taken until certainty settled into something manageable. Until he could be sure that attention had drifted elsewhere. Until the city forgot the question it had begun to ask. He knew it was a lie. Watching without permission changed something fundamental. He found himself anticipating their routines, measuring time not by meetings or deadlines, but by when Sophia would leave work or when Noah's school day ended. The distance he maintained did nothing to dull the pull. If anything, it sharpened it. Sophia noticed the world the way she always had, by feeling its edges. She sensed pressure without seeing its source. A passing awareness that lingered a moment too long. She dismissed it, as she had learned to dismiss many things. Survival required prioritizing what could be proven. Daniel watched her dismiss it, and felt something tighten. He had built his life on the belief that distance prevented harm. Now he stood on the other side of that belief, watching the cost of it play out in real time. He was present without being known, responsible without being acknowledged. It was a position he had chosen, and one he could not easily leave. At night, when the reports slowed and the city quieted, Daniel sat alone with the weight of what he was doing. He had inserted himself back into Sophia's life without her consent, without her knowledge. The irony was not lost on him. Protection without permission was still intrusion. But stepping away now would not erase the danger. It would only remove the one restraint holding it back. So Daniel remained where he was, watching, waiting, and learning that distance, once crossed, could never fully be restored. Silence had always protected Daniel. For years it had been his most reliable shield. No reactions to read, no attachments to trace, no patterns that lingered long enough to matter. He had believed that absence erased interest. That if he did not announce what mattered, nothing could be used against him. He had underestimated how loud silence became once it changed. The city began to lean in. It wasn't one move or one mistake. It was accumulation, routes that subtly tightened, questions asked without names attached, curiosity that circled without committing. People who understood power noticed when someone who never watched began watching. Daniel felt it in the reports before he saw it in the streets. A familiar name resurfaced where it didn't belong. Another lingered longer than necessary. Not aggressive. Not reckless. Testing. Waiting for confirmation that the shadow he cast now had a shape. He gave them nothing. No escalation. No retreat. Both would have answered questions he refused to acknowledge. He maintained the same measured distance, widening the perimeter without closing in. If anyone was watching him, they would see discipline, not fear. Still, the pressure built. Sophia sensed it as a change in the air rather than an event. A hesitation she couldn't justify. A glance held a fraction too long. She adjusted without knowing why, tightening routines, trusting instincts she had learned not to ignore. She said nothing to Noah. Children absorb tension, even when it went unnamed. Daniel watched her adapt and understood the cruel irony. The more he stayed invisible, the more visible the risk became. Silence had begun to suggest concealment. Concealment suggested value. Whispers moved through places Daniel did not frequent. Old stories resurfaced, reshaped by speculation. The woman he had once left. The life he had never acknowledged. Rumors didn't need proof to gain traction. They needed patience. Messages arrived that said very little. Invitations framed as courtesy. Warnings dressed as concern. Daniel declined them all. Declining was a language of its own. At night, he stood at his window and studied the city's reflection in the glass. Somewhere within it, lines were being drawn without his consent. Not toward him directly, but toward what he refused to name. That was the danger. Not exposure, but inference. Absence, once noticed, became a map. Daniel understood then that the strategy he had relied on for years had reached its limit. Silence no longer concealed the truth. It outlined it. Every day he remained unseen increased the value of what he hid. The city was learning that there was something Daniel Moretti would not speak of. And in a world that thrived on leverage, that knowledge alone was enough to invite enemies closer. Daniel made the decision before he allowed himself to hesitate. Staying unseen had begun to feel like delay dressed up as discipline. He had told himself that distance was protection, that restraint would outlast curiosity. Now restraint had become a signal. Silence had learned how to speak. He stepped out early, choosing the hour when the city was still undecided about itself. The streets were pale with morning light, sounds muted, movements deliberate. Daniel parked several blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, hands in his pockets, posture unremarkable by design. This was not a confrontation. It was acknowledgement. Sophia was leaving the building when he saw her. She moved with the same careful efficiency he remembered, keys already in hand, attention forward. Noah walked beside her, backpack riding low, his steps matched to hers without instruction. Daniel stopped. For a moment he simply watched, not as a strategist, not as a man calculating risk, but as someone witnessing a life that had continued without him. Noah laughed at something Sophia said. The sound struck Daniel with unexpected force. He took a step forward before he could reconsider. Sophia sensed him before she turned. Recognition crossed her face like a closing door. Not surprise. Not fear. Readiness. Her hand settled on Noah's shoulder, firm and protective. "Daniel," she said evenly. Noah looked between them, curious. "Who's that?" Sophia did not look away from Daniel. "Someone from my past." Daniel lowered himself slightly, instinctively meeting Noah at eye level without thinking about why. The boy studied him with quiet seriousness, unafraid. It unsettled Daniel more than hostility would have. "You're early," Noah observed. A corner of Daniel's mouth lifted despite himself. "So I've been told." Sophia's gaze sharpened. "Why are you here?" The street felt suddenly exposed. Daniel stood anyway. "Because hiding isn't enough," he said. "And because I won't pretend I didn't see you." Silence stretched. Sophia searched his face, as if measuring distance rather than intent. "You should leave," she said. "I will," Daniel replied. He held her gaze without challenge, without demand. "After this." She waited. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I don't expect answers. I only need you to know one thing." His voice remained steady, even as the words settled into him. "I won't disappear again." The weight of it hung between them. Sophia studied him as if listening for the lie she had learned to anticipate. Noah shifted closer to her, sensing the tension without understanding it. "Mom," he said softly. "Are we late?" "No," she replied, eyes still on Daniel. "We're not late." She looked back at him then, something sharp and guarded in her expression. "This doesn't change anything." "I know," Daniel said. But if I bring danger into your child's life? You won't, she interrupted. That's the point, he said quietly. Sophia hesitated, then nodded once. Not acceptance. Not trust. Permission to leave without escalation. She turned and guided Noah down the street. Neither of them looked back. Daniel remained where he was long after they disappeared, his heart pounding harder than it ever had in confrontation. He had not claimed anything. He had not demanded truth. He had stepped into the light and made a promise. And that, he knew, had changed everything. Daniel returned to his apartment as the city folded itself into night. Nothing had changed inside. The same restrained order. The same clean lines. Yet the space no longer felt neutral. It felt provisional, like something he was already preparing to leave behind. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood at the window and watched the lights below shift and rearrange themselves. For years, he had measured the world in leverage and consequence, in what could be gained and what must never be exposed. Power had been simple that way. It asked for nothing except vigilance. Now it asked for restraint. The promise he had made that morning did not echo loudly. It settled. It reshaped. Daniel understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that stepping into the light once meant he could never fully return to the dark. Silence would no longer protect what mattered. Only intention would. He made the necessary calls without ceremony. Certain arrangements ended quietly. Routes were closed. Interests consolidated. He reduced the surface area of his life, not out of fear, but out of choice. Expansion had once been proof of control. Now it felt like excess, risk without purpose. There were questions, of course. There always were. Daniel answered none of them directly. He didn't need to. Those who had learned to read him understood when a decision was no longer open for debate. Later, alone again, he reviewed documents he had avoided for years. Plans designed for continuity. Safeguards meant to outlast him. He signed where required, his name steady. He was not dismantling what he had built. He was shaping what it would become without his constant presence. Power, he realized, was loud only when it was insecure. He thought of Sophia as she walked away that morning, spine straight, hand firm on Noah's shoulder. He thought of the child's quiet observation, the way he had met Daniel's gaze without fear or curiosity tipping into either direction. A child who had grown up without answers, but not without stability. Daniel did not need recognition. He did not need access. He needed space around them, room for their lives to remain ordinary. Safe. Unremarkable. That was what he chose to keep. Not dominance. Not reach. Not the illusion of control that demanded constant reinforcement. He chose discipline. He chose distance when it protected rather than concealed. He chose to carry responsibility without insisting on reward. At the window, Daniel felt the weight of his life shift. Not disappear. Not absolve itself. But settle into something that could be born. Somewhere in the city, Sophia was finishing her day. Noah was being tucked into bed. Neither of them knew the shape of the decisions being made in their absence. They didn't need to. Daniel Moretti had spent years believing legacy was something you left behind. Now he understood it was something you protected, quietly, deliberately, and without asking to be seen.